What's going on, guys? Eli with Eli Tomalka Woodworks here, and today, with the help of Promise Epoxy, I'm going to be bringing you guys a how-to on how to build this charcuterie tray. Alrighty, so we're gonna go ahead and prep our mold for an epoxy pour. We're gonna make sure our mold is dust free. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit that with some air. So once we've got our mold good and dust free, we're gonna hit it with the dry lubricant. And then going in our mold are our chunks of burl. So I've chosen maple burl. This is an ambrosia or a flame maple burl. It's a growth defect in the tree, actually, that forms a burl. So it's an insane, highly figured hardwood, which is what I work with. So these are a great option for a highly figured piece of hardwood to use in these trays. So I'm gonna go ahead and spray these down with some air, make sure there's no dust on these guys, to have a dust-free epoxy pour. So this mold is ready to go. The wood is ready to go. We're gonna go ahead and weight these down in our mold with some taped bricks, taped with Tyvek tape or any kind of clear tape, packing tape sort of deal. This is gonna make sure that our epoxy isn't bonding to the brick, and the epoxy is just grabbing this layer of protection basically, and so it makes it a lot easier to demold, and these bricks aren't gonna be sticking to our piece. So when deciding epoxy, there's lots of kinds of epoxy. I go with the Deep Pour resin, Promise Epoxy. Obviously, we're gonna do a 2-to-1 ratio on this. So it's 2 parts epoxy to 1 part hardener. The ratio is easily laid out in a mixing cup. You can get these online. When going with a burl option for wood, I like to match the burl with a clear resin or a tinted resin, to really show off the burl edges that are going to be locked into this piece. So for this piece, I went ahead and chose a lighter blue color, and we're going to achieve that blue color by using a dye rather than a pigment. So now we're going to go ahead and mix up our epoxy. My shop here is a very well ventilated shop. It's a big space. If you don't have a well ventilated shop, or you're in like a basement or a smaller area, make sure you wear your respirator, because there are fumes that will come off in the mixing process, because it is mixing chemicals and a chemical reaction is starting. Make sure you grab your gloves. You really don't want skin contact with this, as it's not a very natural substance. So we're gonna go ahead and throw our gloves on now. Alrighty, so I've got my Deep Pour resin here. I'm gonna go ahead and I start with part B. I like to pour this in because it's easy math for me. I'm not a math guy. So this one I'm gonna pour, we're gonna go for 10 ounces of hardener, and then we're just gonna double that up, triple rather, up to 30 ounces total of resin on top of the hardener. We're gonna mix that in. Personally, I love to mix with just any old paint stick. Make sure it's nice and clean and ready to go, especially if you're not pigmenting your epoxy. You don't want any dust or anything getting in there. So we're not going for speed, we're going for an evenly mixed epoxy. Get your glasses here. Don't want to forget your glasses. So once again, 10 ounces of the Deep Pour for 10 ounces of the hardener. You want to have it on a nice level surface to be able to accurately measure out your resin. So we're right at 10. That's what we want with the hardener. I'm going to go right in with the resin and bring it right up to 30 ounces. So I like to slow pour it. Don't squeeze the bottle too much, you're not in a rush. So just let that come out and sit in there. Perfect, we're right at 30 ounces. So you can see the 2 separate weights in there, and you can kind of use that as a guide when you're mixing. You don't want any streaks or anything as these 2 chemicals are mixing. So I'm gonna go ahead and add my dye in. So I'm gonna count out how many drops of each pigment I do to achieve my final color. Alrighty, so that was 40 drops there. So for the second dye, I'm going with a darker blue. So I'm gonna drop this dye in there, once again counting the drops. I'm gonna do 15 drops of that for now, and we'll kind of see how that shakes out when we start mixing her up. So I like to take it slow at first, mix from the bottom, bring it to the top, and set in your circular stirring motion. We're trying to avoid soft spots in the final pour. So if you halfway mix your resin, I've seen folks pour it and one side's hard, one side's soft, and that can also happen if you don't mix the correct amount of part A and part B. So as that chemical reaction happens in the curing process, these guys have to be equally mixed and equally distributed, and that starts in your cup. So we're kind of trying to scrape the sides rather than just going crazy mixing randomly. We're going to scrape the sides and the bottom here and kind of draw it all together. Once again, not about time, it's about how well you do it. Cool, so I'm not seeing any streaks anymore. The weight feels right. And this is about ready to pour. When you first pour this, you're gonna see a lot of bubbles kind of start to come out initially. You're gonna wanna keep an eye on that and torch those bubbles on the surface. But you can kind of see how unattractive this resin is with all the air in there. So I'm just gonna go ahead and slowly pour this into the mold here, and you can kind of see, that air splayed out in the resin. And another thing, being a woodworker, wood holds air, and epoxy can help that, but a lot of the times you're going to want to seal it prior, kind of like a seal coat in like a bar top epoxy pour. You're kind of like sealing any of that air that might want to release in there, or making sure it's not going to release during your epoxy pour. There's also pressure chambers and all sorts of stuff you can stick your epoxy in to release that air prior. I think slow mixing and then kind of keeping an eye on it as the curing process starts is a good way to make sure you're getting that air out. I choose to use epoxy and keep it fluent in my work because it allows you to not only dimensionally expand something, it's a multifunctional factor in what it's doing. So you can use it to create little bow ties to stabilize a crack, or you can fill that crack and that crack's never gonna keep expanding. It allows you to rescue a slab per se, or even a tiny piece of wood that's consumed with rot. Like, there's so much you can do with it, and it's very evident in my style because that's the wood I'm picking out. I'm picking out highly figured wood that got there somehow, and it was a little weird how it got there, but epoxy lets me, or helps me at least, accommodate these factors. Alrighty, so at this point our epoxy has sat for a couple days. We're gonna go ahead and demold from my preset mold here and prepare to get this board shaped up and ready to be its final form. So it definitely helps to have a mullet, or mallet, not a mullet. I already have one of those. And then at this point, most of the tension should be released, so we can just go ahead and give it a drop. If it doesn't fall out right away, we can give it a little bit more love. Alrighty, so to get a more square surface for some more even pressure, I'm just gonna go ahead and drop this on the ground. See if she pops out then. And there it is. So this is the back side. Obviously this was the side we had inside the mold, and it obviously gained some epoxy on the bottom side, all those uneven spots. And then the top side is got our burl coming through here and ready to go through some machines. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and flatten both sides of the charcuterie tray using the planer, starting with the top side of the piece up, because that bottom side of the piece is already flat enough to run through this and get a square piece in the end. We'll do a few passes of this with the charcuterie tray and then move over to the drum sander. So now we're running the piece through the drum sander. I've got the 80 grit sandpaper on the drum sander, dust collection running. This is a very important thing at this phase to make sure you've got your dust collection running. So wear a respirator regardless of your dust collection while you're doing this. Make sure your dust collection is on, tuned up, ready to go. And then we are gonna go ahead and take out any planer marks that the planer left on the piece on the top and bottom side, and make sure this thing is nice and flat, ready to go for the table saw in which we will get it squared up. And so now we are running the charcuterie tray through the table saw on all 4 sides, so just removing any excess epoxy on the edges, getting rid of those chamfered edges that the mold may have left you, depending on what mold setup you're using. Alrighty, so now we've got our charcuterie tray all flat, milled up on the table saw, squared up. Now it's time to shape some edges. So with this guy, I'm gonna go ahead and proceed with a chamfered edge. I think it'll match my mitered sides here pretty well, as well as adding that aesthetic value. So this is a pretty standard chamfer bit for the router here. This is just a 1/4 inch router. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get this routed, this top edge. Alrighty, so now that we've got our chamfered edge on the top side here, we're gonna jump right into finish sanding. So I've got my 2 sanders here that are my go-tos. I use Festool. I've got 2 sizes of Rotex. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with my bigger Rotex, and I'm gonna aim to get all of these drum sander lines out of my board. It leaves these streaks, as you can see, they're pretty linear, and it's obvious where they're at. So you just go through with whatever sander you have and start with an aggressive grit. With face grain and epoxy resin, it's gonna happen pretty quick with a good 60 grit, and doing that on all sides. So I start with 60, get all those lines out, work up to an 80, and then immediately jump to 120, 180, and then I do what's called a grain raise or a water pop. I use alcohol. I go ahead and hit the surfaces and the full deal, every side and surface, let it sit for a minute. You get a good idea of what the finished product's gonna look like, which is super fun, as well as you're raising that wood grain, and then you come back and knock it down with the 240, and it just leads to a better finish and a softer touch finish for your piece. With my Festool sanders, they all can accommodate their dust collection systems that collect all the epoxy dust that's in the air. So if you're not using a Festool sander, some sort of sander with a dust extraction system, definitely wear a respirator and take those precautions when sanding for sure. So now we got our 2 surfaces sanded to 60, getting all those planer marks and drum sander marks off. We're just kind of scanning and looking for any low spots. You're gonna kind of be able to see those low spots because the actual dust, the white epoxy dust that breaks off, is gonna sit into those spots. Luckily on this guy, we don't look like we don't have any at all in the epoxy, but I do see a couple right here in my burl. So I'm gonna go ahead and spray these out and apply CA glue to kind of fill those up. Obviously this is a food safe piece. We're gonna be food safe sealing it, but we do want to make sure that nothing can get into the charcuterie tray when the user is applying their meat and cheese and all sorts of good stuff to the board. So open up those little pinholes. So I've got my CA glue here. This is once again just an Amazon special. It's a great, quick, clear option. This is a pretty thin CA glue, and it's gonna be able to work itself down into these spots. And then I'll hit it with the activator. A little goes a long way. You really don't need a lot at all. Alrighty, so I went ahead and worked through my 60 grit, my 80 grit, 120 grit, all the way up to 180. So making sure to cover every single surface. So I'm sanding the surface, sanding the chamfered edge, and then sanding the surface. I did a round over here on the bottom side just to make it a little bit more aesthetic and nice and easy to grab, so there's no sharp edges on the bottom. So I just hand round that over with the hand sander. Once again, working through all those same grits. And now it's time for an alcohol pop. I like to use alcohol instead of water. It's just a normal isopropyl alcohol. Water can saturate the wood in a different way. Depending on what minerals and chemicals and stuff are in your water, it can mess up your finished product. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit the alcohol. I use one of these little garden sprayers, they're super cheap. And they just kind of do an even mist on the piece. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of spread that out, and then I'll hit the reverse side as well. And the alcohol dries super fast, so I just like to set it up on something, and then you're gonna hit it with your last grit, and this guy being 240, so you're never gonna be able to avoid having sanding marks on here. The only thing you're able to control is how small they get. And this, I'm kind of staying at a lower grit at 240, trying to kind of make it not exactly translucent, but enough to be able to see in right into the burl edges. So this is going to set up for a minute, and then I'm going to go proceed with the 240. Alrighty, so with all my projects, I like to drop a marking, kind of branding, if you will. My logo is pretty like an organic shape. It's just letters, so it sits in pretty nicely and matches in with the aesthetic. But yeah, that's my preference. So I've got this ready for oil. So when you're doing a food safe finish, you need a food safe mineral oil as that first layer of moisture rejection. Basically, you're trying to take care of the wood here. The epoxy is going to do its thing for life, but we do want to seal everything out, making it food safe. I'll come in with my personal product that we curate here in my shop, which is Eli's board butter, and that's going to be the sealer. And so this will set in overnight, soak up that mineral oil, and then I'm going to come in once this wood is all dry. I'm going to wipe the excess mineral oil off the epoxy, and I'll come in and do the board butter application. So I'm going to proceed with the mineral oil here. These are little painter's pyramids. They help a lot trying to elevate something to get it finished up. So get yourself some gloves and look for a white label mineral oil, because that's going to mean it's food safe. And then just give it a nice little pour. Kind of let that disperse. Flip it over now. So obviously you can see all those little sanding areas, all those pores we created are getting saturated and filled in with this mineral oil and giving it that translucent quality. This guy is ready to sit up overnight. Make sure you hit all your sides and it's good to go. Started woodworking when I was just a young guy. My dad built our house when I was 3 years old. He had an architect's brain and was always ever improving our home. So we would do home renovation sort of stuff and home improvement sort of things together. That's where I started running machines like miter saws and sanders, and high school came along and picked up fine woodwork. Started working with hardwoods, started falling in love with wood grain and everything it has to offer, and that's where it all started. So yeah, moved down here. I lived in a van that I owned. 6 weeks in the van, got real uncomfortable with that. I was commuting it every day. Ended up buying a camper, which is the same camper I have now. So I was doing labor, hauling junk, moving furniture, that whole 9 yards. And then jumped into a sales role with College Hunks, and I learned a ton about the back end of a business, and that's when I went full time. It was super scary jumping outside of employment by someone else. Leaving that security was, I'd say, the hardest part. Not even thinking about, am I good enough of a woodworker? Am I good enough of an epoxy worker? Am I good enough at selling myself and my brand, and am I good enough at running a business to be able to commit to this and have it pay off? And I'm so glad I did. One, because now I'm self-employed. It's more than just setting your own schedule and doing this and that. You're doing what you love, so it doesn't feel like I'm working a day. And two, it's opened up so many more doors for me to know that I am now putting in 100% into what I love to do in my business, just as much as I could of somebody else's, but kind of confirming that that's what would happen on a daily basis. And every time I sell a piece of furniture or anytime I'm in here doing what I love, it's a testament to myself and my abilities. Just knowing that I'm here, I'm doing it, I'm surviving, I'm paying my bills, and I'm having fun. All right, so we've got our charcuterie tray here. We let this set up overnight with the mineral oil that soaked right into our burl, as you can see here. So now we're gonna go in with phase 2 of finishing, making this a food safe piece. And that's the Eli Tomalka Woodworks Eli's board butter. This is my in-house curated board finish. So it's a food safe mineral oil, organic beeswax, vitamin E, and an organic coconut oil mixture. This is that second layer of moisture rejection, the strongest layer. It's obviously the one that's on top. So a little bit goes a long way in regards to application. Just kind of working this into those pores, those open wood pores, as well as the pores in the epoxy. Beautiful. So it's basically just a thin layer going on every single surface, every single square inch of this charcuterie tray to make sure we've got a good seal. And now this is going to set up for at least 15 minutes. Make sure it's propped up so you can get airflow under it and above it and on all sides, so that can tack up really nice. Alrighty, so we've let our charcuterie tray set up with Eli's board butter applied for 15 plus minutes. It's nice and tacky now. It definitely has a different consistency on the surface than it did when we applied it. So we're going to go ahead and buff it off with a 6-inch wool pad. And I'm just going to go ahead, just kind of go on your fast mode on the drill, circular motions or whatever. And I like to come in with rags, and you can do this whole process with rags or paper towels, but I come in and kind of get that excess off that was left on the pad on the surface from what we removed earlier. So it's just a little tiny film. You can just wipe it away until you stop seeing the streaks. And then I like to just kind of hit the sides by hand. It's a lot easier than trying to finagle this over the side of your workspace. Try to hit it with the drill. So I sell all my boards with these stabilizing rubber feet. You can get them on Amazon. So I'm gonna go ahead and pre-drill these little spots. Got our finished charcuterie tray, and that's the finished product. Well, I appreciate you guys watching. Once again, Eli Tomalka Woodworks. You can find me on Instagram at Eli Tomalka Woodworks. You can find me online at elitomalkawoodworks.com. Make sure to like and subscribe to Promise Epoxy, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Once again, that's my direct at Eli Tomalka Woodworks. So, thanks again. That's a wrap.